Excellent. Okay, so and here we what was that? Good grief. That's not a good start. Okay. All right. Okay. So sailing to Byzantium, a modest exposition, and I'm going to be going through stanza by stanza and pointing out some. So afterwards, okay, for you. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to go through stanza by stanza and point some stuff out. Okay. So all right. So I mentioned before I even assigned the poem, or as I assigned the poem, that there's one of the sort of the complex things about the poem is there's a mythology involved in this. And if you were to become, you say, I want to become a Yeats scholar. That's what I want to do with my life. And one of the things you would find out about Yeats is that that's kind of was his shtick. He wrote for a long time. He started writing when he was young, and he had some early publication success. I mean, he was a known poet when he was young, and then he continued to write till just about his death. I mean, he was. Some poets have they sort of productive bursts in their life, and they keep writing afterwards, but none of the stuff they write is that good. Yeats was someone who wrote all throughout his life and wrote at a fairly consistent quality, so he's a remarkable case. And he sort of invented this kind of mythology as he got older and older. He had this mythology going in his head, and with this set of imagery, and he has lots of poems that kind of work off that. Okay, but so we've got our sense. Byzantium is a real place. Okay, it was originally the Eastern Roman Empire, which became the Byzantine Empire, headquartered in the city that was first known as Byzantium, then known as Constantinople, and is now known as Istanbul. Okay, so he's basing this on a real place, but in this poem, it is an ideal place. So this is a case of a mythology where you take something real as a kind of model for something that is ideal. Okay, now, if you want a related thing that you might be more familiar with, in the book of Revelation, the last book in the New Testament, there's the discussion of the New Jerusalem. Okay, and at one point the New Jerusalem would come down out of the sky, if I remember correctly. Now, Jerusalem was a real place, okay, but when in the book of Revelation it refers to the New Jerusalem, it is not the same place as the old one. Okay, it's in some ways based on the old one, but it's a sort of an improved version of it. And in fact, if you want to see poets doing something similar to what Yeats is doing with Byzantium, off of this idea of the New Jerusalem, there's William Blake. There's a famous, it's a section of his poem. It's actually a hymn that's sung in Anglican or Episcopalian church. It's called Jerusalem. And so, and one line is like, I shall not cease from mental fight till we have seen Jerusalem on England's green and pleasant land. So this idea is like, we need to make this place into the New Jerusalem. Okay? Now, so you've got, in this poem then, I think you can set up an opposition. Okay, I'm going to talk about a number of oppositions in this poem. And you can have the real world, which is, I think we can say, is Ireland. Okay, that's a kind of an interpretation on my part. I think when he says salmon falls, okay, salmon is an Irish fish. Okay, they don't really have salmon in England. So I think when he says salmon falls, he's saying what he's talking about is Ireland. That's my interpretation. But I definitely know that we've got Byzantium as the ideal world. So it's an opposition between the real world of Ireland and the ideal world of Byzantium. Okay? Now, here's the key, the secret to the poem. Okay? The secret to the poem. The central conflict of the poem is life versus art. Okay? So you've got two opposing choices. Life versus art. In fact, this is again, Yeats was a guy who's obsessed with a set of ideas and kept writing about the same ideas again. He has another poem called The Choice, and it begins with this line: the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work. Okay, and there he's talking in kind of very sort of practical terms. In terms of, if you want to be a great artist, you are going to have a lousy life. There's just no two ways about it. You can't have a good life and be a great artist. You can have a great life, but you're never going to make great art. Okay, and you can actually see, although Yeats did not misbehave in terms of drinking and things like that, or his relations with women were very ideal. He had these women that he was madly in love with, but that were already married and things like that. So it all got to be ideas in his head. But if you think in terms of sort of like people that promote the idea of writers need to drink, writer needs to be a drunk, it's sort of a version of this kind of idea. If you can ruin your life, then you can produce great work. Okay, it's just one possibility. I'm not at all arguing for this. In fact, if you've got the choice, I'd say go for as perfect a life as you can, and leave it up to some other fool to make the art. Okay, so here's our first stanza then. Okay, that is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh, or fowl, commend all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglect. Why am I skipping the last line of this? All monuments of unaging intellect. Okay, all right. This wasn't the best PowerPoint I've ever made. Okay, all right. That's the first mistake in PowerPoint so far. Okay, notice this. But if you look at look in the book there, this stanza is all the portrait of Ireland. Okay, so this is Ireland. This is the real world. Everything he's talking about. This is what the real world is like. Okay, and some a picture of Ireland, the real world. And when he says no country this is no country for old men, he says and this is the real world. It's the world of life. Sort of the world of life versus art. The real world is on the side of life. Okay, and life is for the young. Notice that description previously. That's all young things, young beings. Okay, and what is the main thing that the young are doing? The young are busy reproducing. That's their main obsession in life, their main activity. Notice all the images in that stanza. The young in one another's arms. They're wooing each other. The birds in the trees at their song. Okay, why do the birds sing? The birds sing to attract mates. All right. Or someone that's actually the recent Duck Dynasty controversy. One of the things they're pointing out is that the duck call. What you do with the duck call is you're pretending basically that you're a duck interested in mating. Okay, so you sit in your duck line and with your gun and your camo, and you do the duck call, and you're basically you're placing like a Craigslist ad for wanted. I'm single. I'm a single duck. I'm interested in. Okay, so that's the same thing that Yeats is talking about. Okay, the salmon falls. Why did the salmon go up the river? To reproduce, right? That's what they're doing there. The mackerel crowded seas. That's when the fish swarm. In this case, they're swarming to reproduce. Fish, flesh, or fowl commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born, and dies. So notice here. So this idea like this life is for the young, and the purpose of life is reproduction. And he in that those 3-word phrase there. Or that line, the 6th line, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. Those 3 words, begetting, so that's conceiving life, getting born, so after the life is conceived, it is born, and then what's the only thing left for it to do, other than more begetting, in the meantime, is die. Okay, so there's basically three things in life. You're born, you beget further life, and then you die. That's it. As far as this sort of life versus art debate, that's what all life is about. There's an example I like to talk about is Aristotle, the famous ancient Greek philosopher. And one of his books was called The Book of Generation and Corruption. Okay, and interestingly enough, this was a biology book. This was a book about biology. Okay, and the idea is when you're studying biology, you're studying things that come into being and things that go out of being. Okay, so some things come into being and some things go out of being. Okay, there. Okay, and so when he talks about sensual music, so the line where caught in that sensual music, all neglect, monuments of an aging intellect. You could think, well, he's against, and some people in the online class in the discussion talked about, well, he's against materialism. And when we say materialism in our culture, we tend to think people that are too into stuff, too into their things, their iPhones, their clothes, their cars, spending money. And that's what we say. If you're too materialistic, you're too into that stuff. This poem would be against things like iPhones and cars, maybe. But the thing is, it's not just materialism in our sense that the poem is complaining about, but life itself. This physical life, this life of begetting, being born, and dying. That's the complaint there. Okay. And so now we move on to our second stanza. We're still in the realm of the. We start off in the realm of the living, but we get out of it by the end of the stanza. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress. Nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. Therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. Notice the therefore here. That's setting up like he's making an argument here. And here's all the premises, and then here's the therefore leads us to the conclusion. Given all this stuff here, the conclusion is going to Byzantium. Okay? So what's going on here? First off, the old people have nothing but singing. Okay? So young people can do the begetting and being born thing. And then the old people, up until the point when they die, okay, which is the last thing they have to do, the only thing they can do is sing. That's the only. It's like young people can live, and then old people can talk. Basically, this sort of opposition there. And then, as I said, it was an argument there in the stanza. And what's going on here is sort of an argument through metaphors. All right. So one of the important things you have to realize is when a poet talks about song, okay, anytime a poem mentions song, it's a metaphor for poetry. So anytime a poetry is talking about song or singing, they're actually talking about poems and writing poetry. Singing is writing poetry. Okay. So when he mentions the singing school, he's talking about a poetry school. So if you're an old man and the only thing available for you is singing, and so you say, well, okay, how do I do that? How do I become a singer? How do I become a poet? You have to go to poetry school. And then when the one line, nor is there singing school, but studying monuments of its own magnificence. So there are no teachers in the singing school. There are only the objects themselves, the great objects of song, the greatest poems. So the poetry school is the greatest poems. Okay, so don't go to class, don't go to college, don't get a professor. Okay, just go out and read great poems. All right, that's the lesson there. And he might have a point. I must admit there's something to that what he's saying. And so then when we get if we go through all these points in the argument, then the conclusion is that Byzantium is a repository of art. Okay, so we're in Byzantium that we have basically a big collection of art going on. All right. There. Okay. I'm going to backtrack. This is terrible, but I sort of lost track of my notes. One more point I want to make about this. Looking at my notes that I missed. Okay. When there's this Aristotle thing, the book of generation and corruption, and this idea of coming into being and going out of being. One of the things about the ancient world and ancient thought, philosophical thought, that there's a prejudice against this change. There's a prejudice against things that change. Okay, so if you look at someone like Plato, Plato says that anything that changes, anything that was not in existence at one point, is in existence now, and goes out of existence, is false. Okay, so if I look at that tree and I look out the window of the tree, and that tree's got leaves on it now, but it doesn't have leaves on it now, but it's going to have leaves on it in a couple months, and then after it's going to lose its leaves, and then at one point it's going to fall down and not even be there at all. Plato says there's something false about that. You can't ever say, if I make the statement the tree has leaves, Well, it does now, but you give it another couple months and it won't. Okay, so there's something false about that statement. The only things that are true are eternally true. So only things that are unchanging and eternal are true. The greatest good then has to be things that are unchanging and eternal. So that's another feature going on. Okay, back to so we got down. Byzantium is the repository of art. Okay, here. And so we've got the site, Byzantium is the repository of art. Okay, wait, I can put that. Repository of art. And so you think so Byzantium is a museum, okay? So it's this collection of this great art. But there's an important thing to think about here. It's not just a museum for you to go in and look at, so just sort of passively observe this stuff. It's a place where you're supposed to learn how to make more art, okay? In fact, in the old days, like I don't know if I've been to the Louvre a couple times, the big museum in Paris, and I may have seen this or not, but in the old days, what you get quite often happen in the Louvre is you get art students who would come in with their painting kits, and they would sit themselves down in front of a painting, and they would paint a copy of it, okay? And that was a way to learn how to paint. You say, like, boy, I really like this painting. I really would like to know how to do a painting like that. So the way I'm going to learn how to do a painting by that is I'm going to try to make a copy of it, okay? Now, so the thing is that if Byzantium is a museum or repository, it's not just a passive place for us to look at. It's supposed to be the place that you go to learn to make more art. Okay, so that's an important thing. All right, yeah. So our next one. Okay, so now we've made it to Byzantium. Okay, so he has come to Byzantium. And this is what Byzantium is like. So now we start getting a description of Byzantium. O sages standing in God's holy fire, as in the gold mosaic of a wall, come from the holy fire, burn in a gyre, and be the singing masters of my soul. Consume my heart away, sick with desire, and fastened to a dying animal that knows not what it is, and gather me into the artifice of eternity. Okay? Now, again, this is a sideline. If you do in the Yeats mythology thing, turn and gyre both have technical terms. Actually, he thought that the universe and life was, in history was all a matter of these gyres, these spirals, but they were conical. So they start off as a point and then expand. You go through this spire and expand. And so this was this idea like, you had an age in which, a historical age in which spirituality was not very important, but then at the end of the historical age, spirituality had become more important. Okay, but it wasn't just as simple as that, because at the same time, there's these contradictory things going on, and so that there was something that was important at the beginning of that age, and it would be decreasing as you went along. And so all of life was a matter of being caught between these increasing and decreasing gyres. Now, if you go become a scholar, you need a browser over there. If you go and become a scholar on Yeats, you have to understand this stuff. Actually, for a regular poetry reading, you don't. And to be honest, I don't think it's a strong point of his poem, these sort of fancy, weird mythology terms. But if you're just curious about what he means, burn in a gyre, it's a super crazy mythology he's talking about there. All right. So notice what we've got here at the beginning of this. We've got what we call an invocation. Okay. O sages standing in God's holy fire. He's addressing it. O sages. And then he's making a request. He's making a request. Come from the holy fire and be the singing masters of my soul. I was thinking of an example like this morning. My daughter, the 11-year-old, I have to brush her hair. I don't know why on earth I ended up being the person who's brushing her hair, but I am. But to get her to sit still, she has to watch Pokemon on the internet. And I was thinking, when I read this morning, I was thinking, it looks like what Ash says. What he calls on, like, Bulbasaur, I call on you. And he throws it. And so Ash is doing an invocation there. He's calling on Bulbasaur, whatever, and for a purpose. He wants that Bulbasaur to do something. And so that's what Yeats is doing, of course. Very fancy version with Yeats. He's calling upon the sages to help him. Okay. Now notice here that it's if you're really paying attention to the details, something odd's going on here. In the previous stanza, he was talking about poems, but now all of a sudden he's talking about poets. And this is something that's quite often a confusion where some people have a hard time keeping track of the difference between poems and poets. And Yeats is kind of doing a little bit of a slip there. But that's not that big a deal. Now, when he says, as in a gold mosaic on the wall, okay, so actual Byzantium was famous for its mosaic art. And here I found, here's an actual picture. So here's a Byzantine mosaic, okay? And so I think I don't know how well the color is showing up, but there's the gold mosaic. So that's the gold leaf mosaic there. And here's a set of dudes, okay? I think that's the emperor. That seems to be the bishop. These would be, some of the soldiers and stuff like that. And you could picture that, like if you were Yeats, maybe your eyesight wasn't so good and you're squinting at it. Maybe those look like sages there, standing before you. So that's the image that he's working off of there. Which brings me to an interesting thing, is that one of the things he's going on there, he's got this abstract idea, Byzantium, this ideal place. But in order to convey this abstract idea, he's relying on concrete imagery. So he's taking actual details of the actual Byzantium and using it to paint his picture of this ideal world. And in writing in general, and this is a piece of advice to you guys, even when you're writing tedious papers for college, nothing beats concrete details, okay? Even if you're trying to present an idea, an abstract idea, nothing beats concrete details in trying to do that, okay? And so you can use the Yeats poem as an example of that. Okay, so some more identifications here. Notice when he talks about heart, what he's actually referring to is soul. And so when his heart being fastened to the dying animal, we have the distinction between the soul and the body, and the idea that the soul is detachable. Okay, it's just attached to this animal. Notice that the body, and of course, what the body is doing is it's dying, right? Because it's a living thing. My soul is eternal. His soul is eternal. His body is a living thing, and since it's old and it's no longer doing any more begetting, the only thing left for it is dying. Okay, so now it's dying. Okay. So the body is a part of life. And also notice when he says sick with desire, what's desire about? Desire is about the drive for reproduction, right? The desire to reproduce. So again, those themes that were brought up in the first stanza have come back here, okay? And then, so there's a consume my heart away, this idea that he can lose himself. He's asking to be lost in art, okay? And when he says the artifice of eternity there, notice that the art the artifice is another term for art. Now notice there's something interesting about that. There's a contradiction involved in that. If this Platonic idea, Plato idea, about stuff that comes into being is inferior and stuff that's eternal is superior, well, artifice is made stuff, right? And so that's stuff that comes into being, right? Before he wrote this poem didn't exist, all right? And it came into being. So when he says artifice of eternity, there's always something paradoxical or even contradictory about that. And then that will become more obvious as we go along. Also notice what you've got here is the idea of art as a kind of substitute for religion. So that your devotion to art, your life in art, can do the same kind of thing that a devotion to religion or a life in religion could do. And when Yeats was a young man and first writing, this was an idea in Great Britain. This idea was a very popular idea amongst artists. The previous generation, a famous critic named Matthew Arnold, who talked about this. And if you take someone like Oscar Wilde, the sort of the aestheticism of Oscar Wilde was kind of involved with this kind of thing as well. Okay, and so then now we're getting toward the end. So one side of nature. Okay, notice how there's a very clear progression in this poem. It's got a clear plot. Every stanza seems to be setting up a different, almost like aspect of the argument. And the next stanza begins with, from the point that the last stanza was ended. Okay, so once out of nature I shall never take my bodily form from any natural thing, but but such a form as Grecian goldsmiths make, of hammered gold and gold enameling to keep a drowsy emperor awake, or set upon a golden bough to sing to lords and ladies of Byzantium of what is past or passing or to come. Okay, so again, one of the things so now we're in what it would be like to be in Byzantium. Okay, so the first stanza is what it's like to be in the world of the living, in life. Last stanza is what it's like to be in Byzantium. Okay, notice again the concrete imagery here. Okay, there's a note you can get somewhere where Yeats was talking about this poem, and he says, yeah, I think I read in a book somewhere that there was such a tree in the emperor's court in the Byzantine Empire. The emperor of the Byzantine Empire, he had such a tree made of gold and silver and had artificial birds on it that sang. Now notice the way Yeats put that up. He says, like, I think I read in a book somewhere that was a real thing. So he gets this idea of this concrete imagery from the real world. However, he could have been wrong. You know, he didn't give a citation. He didn't say, oh, in such and such book that mentions this thing. It was kind of like something he read in passing, or maybe something he misread in passing. But that's okay for him, because he can get it to work in his poem. It sort of reminds me of the Keats being wrong about the discoverer of the Pacific. It was not Cortez, it was Balboa. But as far as the poem goes, that's just fine. All right. Now, at this end of this poem, there's a certain kind of irony that's coming out. Okay, and this is an important and complicated idea. Irony in general means saying one thing but meaning another. Okay, so the famous sarcasm example I always like doing is I'm helping my brother on a house project. I drop a hammer on his head, and my brother says, thank you. Okay, now he said thank you, but he doesn't mean that. He means the exact opposite of thank you. Okay, so irony is saying one thing and meaning another. So notice here, at the end of this poem, the greatest thing turns out to be not so much. Okay, so if we go back here, so you know this weird thing is like he's become a mechanism. Okay, so he's no longer a thing. He's just like this little mechanical thing. Okay, but maybe you're into that. Maybe you you want to be a robot, or what is it? I've read sometimes back. There's some people, the futurist types, have this idea that they're going to be able to make robots, and they're going to download our brains into these robots, and we'll be immortal. Okay, so some people think the idea of being a mechanism is okay. That's cool. But notice he's not a mechanism. He's a mechanism, but notice he's a servant. Okay, you know, he's not like the poet emperor of this Byzantium. He's a servant. He's a servant of the poet. He just sits there and sings songs for the emperor. Okay, well that's a lesser thing. I thought, you know, if I were this great goal in life, I'd want to be something more, more powerful than that. And notice, not only is he just a servant for this emperor, his job is to keep the emperor awake. Okay, the emperor's falling asleep, and he's going to sing this song to keep the emperor awake. It's like, wow, he's just an entertainment. He's just like a sideline. You know, he could be a juggler or a monkey, trained monkey, and it would do the exact same thing that he's doing now. So there's something strange. Like, boy, if we had this invocation, well, this is the thing that I want from life. This is where I want to end up. It doesn't seem to have ended up at that great a place. Okay. Not only that, though. Not only that is that there's this contradiction. Notice the thing when it turns out when he's done with this and he's singing this song just to keep the emperor awake. What is the song about? What is the very last line? Singing of what is past or passing or to come. Okay? And where did we get a set of three terms like that in the poem? In the first stanza, we had begotten, born, and died. Okay? What is the song he's singing once he gets his dream job? He's singing about life. He's singing about things that used to be, things that are about to stop, about to be no longer. I mean, they're passing, they're about to pass out of being, and then there are things in the future that will come into being. What? I thought you were going to get out of this all. What is this that all of a sudden you said this was your big escape, and you're still obsessed with where you came from. All right. So in closing, this is a sort of a lesson of the kind of things that you can do with a poem. So this is obviously a contradiction. All right. You wanted to get out of life, This was all supposed to be about life versus art. You wanted to get out of life, and you paint your ideal picture. It can be any way you want it to be of what it's like when you get into art and out of life. And the thing is, the only thing you can talk about anymore is life. Okay, so that's a contradiction. Something a poem can do is present unresolved contradictions. He's saying you've got this choice between life versus art. I can talk big about now, I'm going to have perfection in my art and no perfection in my life, but you still haven't gotten past the contradiction. It's like taking a paradox and setting it into balance. Okay, so he says life is superior, art is superior to life, you might say, but then the only suitable subject for art is life, right? What are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about what it's like to be alive. What things are important for living beings. Okay, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the famous 20th century American writer, United States writer, said, "The true test of a first-rate mind is the ability to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time." And quite often this is taken as something about writing fiction and poetry. Okay, now, for those of you who studied psychology, and especially political psychology, what this is quite often referred to as cognitive dissonance. Okay, so two contradictories at the same time. So, for example, if I'm a voter and I think I want my taxes lowered, okay, so I want the government to have less money, but at the same time I want government services increased, that's a contradiction, right? Because if you're taking away money from the government's not going to be able to give you more services. They're going to give you fewer services, okay? But if you have those two ideas in your head at the same time, you're doing what Fitzgerald said was the sign of a first-rate mind. But anyone that talks about cognitive dissonance, they say, well, this is a sign of second-rate minds. Okay, people that are not thinking through things thoroughly enough are victims of cognitive dissonance. Okay, so what's the difference here? I think what the difference is that you have these two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time, but you never lose track of the fact that they are a contradiction. Okay, you want these two things. They're not compatible. They're not resolvable, but you still want them at the same time. You kind of like anguish through them. You acknowledge the contradiction. You acknowledge the tension and stuff like that. Okay? All right, just 1 second. I will turn this fabulous recording off.